Good morning, everyone. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I'm moderating today's webinar. I'm going to give it another 2-3 minutes to let people trickle in, and then after that, I'll introduce our speaker and get us started on the presentation. Okay, I think the trickle is stabilizing. Good morning, everyone. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. Today, I'm very pleased to host Professor Michael Acklin from the University of Pittsburgh, who is going to tell us about effective policy responses to global crises based on historical lessons from energy shocks, a topic that he's really been studying for the past decade. So I think we are all in for a real treat here. The way we're going to do this, I'm just going to ask Michael to give us the presentation, which is going to be about half an hour. And in the meantime, for the participants, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. I'm going to keep an eye on it and I'm going to moderate it. That will allow us to go through all the questions and have a good discussion with Professor Acklin today. All yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the presentation and the conversation afterwards. So, like many of us, I think I've spent a lot of time doing engaging in some reflection about the state of the world, which tends to be fairly depressing, regardless of where you look. Those of us who are worried about climate change have a lot of reasons to worry. Those of us worried about public health have also obviously a major crisis in their hands. And then many of us also worry about the economy. Will it get started again? And if so, under what will it look like? And so there's, it's a time of serious uncertainty. And more generally, I would say it's an era of crisis, right? We had the 2008 financial crisis. We had a number of conflicts, ongoing conflicts, past conflicts. And it doesn't feel really that it's a stable times right now. Now, of course, this is not the first era of that kind. Those of you who are into history may know that Western Europe in the early 1300s was not looking great either. It was a time when you had simultaneously or almost simultaneously a plague, you had climate change and political instability. And so, these times also look very much like what we're experiencing right now. But history is not my specialty. I'm more interested in thinking about recent crises. And I want to think more about how governments respond to these events. Because we tend to see these times, besides their the downside to them, we see them as opportunities, right? There are opportunities to change the way the world works. And we want to think about that. And I think a lot of people spend time thinking about how we should respond to crisis, what we should, what is that world, that's utopia we'd like to create. But we don't really spend as much time thinking about how governments can and how they should respond to these shocks, because that's kind of the, filling the blanks between the world we want to reach and where we are right now. Well, it's going to depend a lot on what governments do. And so my specialty is to think more about what governments do, what kind of policies they implement, and just as importantly, why they implement them. What is the motivation that governments have in terms of responding to these shocks? So what I want to do today for the next half hour is really just two things. So one is I want to look at past energy shocks, because energy is the area I'm interested in. I'm interested in energy for all kinds of reasons. It is important for our welfare. It is important if you care about the environment. So all kinds of reasons why we are interested in this. And I want to study a bit what we've learned since the 1970s, because what we learned then could help us shape and form better strategies for coping with the current crisis. And that's going to be the second half of this presentation. It's going to be about drawing these lessons from the past and think about both opportunities and challenges for the present. I want to just add a few kind of terms and conditions here before I get started. I want just to make sure I'm a social scientist, so I'm not an engineer, I'm not a natural scientist, I'm not somebody who will be able to necessarily have the strongest argument about two competing technologies. What my strength is to think about governments, about their preferences and what makes them tick. That's really what I'm interested in. That's what hopefully I'm going to be able to contribute something to. The second term and condition that I want to mention is that the conversation is going to be about energy in general. It's going to be about its different forms of usage, but I'll often focus more narrowly on electricity, which is one area that has seen perhaps the most changes over the past 40, 50 years. And that's why I want to focus a little bit more on this, but again, with a conversation that is going to be as broad as possible. So again, the plan for the next half hour is really, I want to look a bit more at the past, about energy shocks in the past, and then I want to kind of try to draw together what we've learned from these experiences to kind of think, if I were an activist today, well, what kind of principles would I want to think about, right? What should I be careful about? What should I think about more carefully when I want to move the world forward from the crisis we are currently facing these days. All right. So with this being said, let's get started with thinking more about the past energy transitions, past energy shocks. Now, we know that electricity and energy most generally is really important for modern welfare. We know that households, how happy they are, how well they're doing economically speaking, depends a lot on whether they have access to cheap and abundant energy. And even at the more macro level, when we think about how economies have evolved over the past 400 or 500 years, it has really been the case that every stage of economic development has come with a new stage in terms of how we've been using energy. Right? We have had a number of transitions in the past, and they have generally all been trending towards being able to use more energy and making it more affordable and being able to power more stuff, more appliances, larger industries, and therefore being able to really scale up our economy. And that has been, historically speaking, until the 1970s, has been generally the trend. We've always kind of tried to gravitate towards more and better. And there's very interesting work by Václav Smil, who has been doing a lot of this. He has written an incredible book on energy and its usage over history that I encourage everybody to read. And one of the observations he made is that we have really these waves where we have new sources of energy or new technologies that allow us really to build out our economy and go further in how much we can produce and how much we can consume. Historically speaking, we started with relying mostly on biofuels, right? So we burn things and use that energy. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we started to use coal. And then at the turn of the century, we started to use more and more oil. And then we used also increasingly more natural gas, right? And as you can see, for instance, with coal here is that, well, it started to grow, it became more and more important, and then its importance started to decline, right? Then we started to find something even better than that. It didn't completely disappear, right? It was still there, but it was starting to be replaced in terms of being the primary thing that we're using in terms of to power our economies. And the last here on this particular graph is the growth of nuclear energy, right? Which was after World War II, again, a new source that would promise a lot of very cheap electricity, at least until recently. So historically speaking, we had had these transitions. What is important to note is that they were driven really by these considerations of being having more electricity, more energy, and in an affordable manner. And the second part is really that they eventually declined and were replaced by something else. So that was really the logic so far, and that kind of held together until the 1970s, when we had a series of energy crises that hit and made people question whether we should continue along the same path. So of course, I'm referring here to the first oil crisis, which happened in 1973 and represented a major change in terms of how our economies would think about energy consumption. So here we have oil price data from BP until 1972, and you can see this kind of declining trend where we had access for all matters of purposes to very affordable oil, and it looked that it was going to be increasingly affordable. And then of course, crisis in the Middle East, and then this massive shock, which really very rapidly made it clear that the era of having plentiful and cheap oil may not necessarily last. It was going to return to a lower price eventually, but psychologically the damage was done. It was clear that we could not just simply assume that energy would always be, from fossil fuel, would always be cheap and affordable, cheap and plentiful, but there could be these political events that could change our perspective on this. And so that changed a lot of things, because if you think about energy systems, these are very complicated, complex systems, right? They are machines in some sense that require all kinds of input, and you cannot just tweak things and change things on short notice. And so these shocks were really important because they encouraged policymakers, voters, interest groups to try to think of a world that would not be directly relying as much anymore on fossil fuels, on oil and on gas. And that's what the series of oil crises, 73, 79, really did. And then there were a second set of crises, which affected nuclear energy, which was this big alternative, right? Which could meet all our needs at an affordable price. And this consensus also was shaken in the 1970s and 80s with the 3 Mile Islands incident and the Chernobyl accident, which led to a lot of public opposition to the nuclear power. And so we are essentially by the mid 80s in a situation where a lot of people were unhappy with the current state of affairs and wanted to see a major change, right? Which is not unlike what we're in some sense experiencing right now in many different areas. What differed, however, is that different political leaders across the world reacted in very different ways to this shock. And we need to think a bit about how they responded and what made them respond differently, because that will help us understand better how currently our leaders may respond to the COVID crisis, to the climate crisis, and other problems that we are facing. And so that's been part of, that's been the core of a book that I co-wrote with Johannes, Renewables, the Politics of a Global Energy Transition, where we think about how governments react and respond to these massive shocks, right? So how did government respond to the 1970s oil and nuclear shocks, and what did they do that led us to the world we are right now? And perhaps there are some lessons to be drawn, and again, that's what I'm going to come back at the very end. And what we show in this book is that there are really three steps that matter that characterize responses. There is first the initial response, which is what we tend to think of a lot. We tend to think about the immediate response. What could we do right now to make the world different? But that's not the end of the story. In fact, we need to think more carefully about what happens once the dust settles, right? So once the crisis doesn't feel as heavy on our shoulders anymore, well, what's then the next step? And we need to think about this. Again, if you, for instance, are here because you're interested in thinking about COVID, we need to think about what kind of policies are going to be implemented a year from now, when perhaps this is not going to be as acute a problem anymore, right? And so that's next second step is also very important. And then the third step in our story was, once solutions to the oil and nuclear crisis had been found, is to think about the diffusion of these solutions. And here, of course, given the title of the book, it is going to be about renewable energy, right? Renewable energy was one of the responses to the 1970s shocks, and then it has spread across the world. And so it's to think about what can accelerate the spread of these solutions and what can slow them down. So let me briefly talk about each of these steps, because they really will tell us something a bit more about how governments manage and cope with crises. So when oil price spiked, what we see is that many countries did something. They implemented some kind of response. They could not just stay put and say, let's wait. The magnitude of the change was so dramatic that they had to do something in order to make sure that their voters would not get too upset of them. And in general, the aim here, when we think about the oil crisis, was to reduce dependence on oil, right? What can we do to make sure that we're not going to be hit as severely next time something like this happens? And there were kind of two main strategies here. So the first one was to build out existing technologies, and that's what, for instance, France did. France had a very active nuclear program. It was partly caused by by security concerns it had. It wanted to have an independent foreign policy. This is a time of General de Gaulle, and there was a sense of, let's try to make sure we are independent from the US and from others. And so it meshed well with them that the natural response was to develop a non-military, non-security nuclear program that would allow them to have all the electricity they need without having to rely all that much on oil-producing countries. The second strategy was to explore new technologies, and several countries really led the way here. The US was one of the first big investors into promoting renewable energy, not so much in terms of deployment underground, but more in terms of coming up with new technologies. The US has a lot of universities. It has a lot of interest in developing new technologies that it can sell elsewhere after. And so it was a natural grant for this. Germany was also, and Denmark were both also natural grants for this, partly because they had a lot of knowledge in terms of wind technology. It's very windy in northern Germany and in Denmark. They have a long history of using wind technology for all kinds of purposes. And therefore they had this knowledge in terms of having enough experts that could get such a program kickstarted. Now, why one response was chosen rather than the other? Well, it depended on these contextual factors that I just mentioned, right? Did you have experts around? It also depended on the ideology of political actors, right? What were their preferences? Interest groups mattered as well. We had at the same time the birth of environmental NGOs, and they were active lobbyists in some countries, like in Germany, they became quite powerful. And so in countries that kind of pushed for this, they implemented a range of policies. They funded research and development. They implemented feed-in tariffs for renewable portfolio standards and so forth. No need to go in details in terms of what these policies really do, except to notice that they were essential in the long run. Because I'm emphasizing here the long run, because initially there were very few results, right? If we look at the usage of renewable energy in these countries by 2000, it was very small. So here is the share of electricity that comes from renewables, excluding hydropower, which is a mature technology. So here we're talking about solar and wind. Well, by 2000, it didn't look like much, right? The US and Germany would be ahead, but the contribution of renewables was still very, very small. What really mattered was not the short-term impact of these technologies, but their long-term consequences. And that's this period between the 1980s and the early 2000s, which was really critical if we want to understand the world in which we live right now. What the policy that I mentioned before did, renewable investment in research and development, thinking about these feed-in tariffs and so forth, was not so much that they produced a lot immediately, but they planted the seeds of creating a movement later that was able to promote its own interests. And that's going to be a case where you have an intense phase of what we call politicization, which is really just fights between the proponents of renewables and the opponents. And this fight, the success of either group in this fight, really explains to what degree some countries are nowadays leaders and some other countries are nowadays lagging somewhat behind. And one example here is Germany and the US, right? So Germany, you saw the creation of interests of firms that were in favor of promoting renewables, and they were able to effectively lobby politicians across the spectrum and make sure that the policies that they needed to survive this initial development phase would stay in place in the long run. In the US, on the other hand, we had a number of setbacks. The Reagan era was not especially kind to these growing renewable seeds, right? So they were fairly hostile. They cut funding to many of these research programs. And that slowed down the US considerably in a way that did not happen in Germany. And so this phase is really important. And the reason I'm, again, focusing on this phase in this presentation right now is that when we think about how to react to crisis, we like to think about what's happening right now, and we like to think that we should get everything right now. But instead, what we should also really be thinking is, what's going to happen 5, 10, 20 years from now? And how can we ensure that what we're doing right now will help us down the road? And once we take that into account, so again, we see that countries such as Germany have had a lot of success in deploying renewables in its countries, whereas the US, despite its initial growth, it stagnated for a long time, and it's only in the last 10 years or so that it really started to pick up again, and even so, at a pace that is still behind Germany. And we can see that France, even though it didn't really do much about renewables for a very long time, has now been able to start to catch up with the US as well, right? And so that's really the time between the 80s and the 2000s were really critical to get the picture to what we see right now, because that's been when the battles were won and lost, and may explain why a country like Germany is so far ahead the curve, or Denmark for that matter, compared to some of the other large economies in the world. So that leads me to the second half of what I want to talk about today, after having provided you with this kind of brief history of renewable energy, to think about lessons, opportunities, and challenges, which is a topic that is the core of today's webinar. And there are a number of lessons, and this is a bit of a wall of words in front of you, but I want to focus on political lessons. Again, I'm not an engineer. I don't want to tell you what technology is going to be superior 50 years from now. What I want to think about is, if I were somebody who was an activist and I want to have some kind of guiding principles in terms of what I should be doing, here are some of the lessons that may help us overcome some of the obstacles that we're experiencing right now in countries like the US. So the first thing to really think hard about is that even if you're in power right now, even if your favorite leader is elected, that leader will eventually be kicked out, right? And what we want to think about then is we need to implement programs that have a higher chance of surviving the opposition being in power. Not all policies are going to be equally likely to survive. That's the key, the key thing to think about, is that some policies will become increasingly stronger as time passes. And these are the kind of policies you want, because they will be much harder to remove later in time, right? Perhaps here, thinking back about some of the New Deal policies, right? It took a long time for those who didn't like them to overturn them, and that's because they were able to really be resilient to losing to their creator losing power. I mentioned here the example of Germany because I think that's one that is illustrative of what I'm talking about here. Germany in the 1980s implemented initially a lot of pro-renewable energy policies under the Social Democrats, so the center-left party, which was kicked out of power at the very beginning of the 1980s and replaced by a center-right coalition. Now, for all kinds of reasons, we may have expected that coalition to just drop what was these renewable energy policies and move back to the previous situation. There was no clear incentive for them to keep these policies alive. But what happened is that there were many interests, even among the center right, who were in favor of them, and not just for ideological reasons. For instance, you had farmers who were very happy to rent out or to host small hydropower stations on the rivers where they had land on, right? So it was a way for them to add more income. And even though it is not a natural alliance to think about some of the conservative Bavarian farmers and green tree-hugging hippies in Germany, they created these coalitions that helped these policies survive in power, even though their initial proponents lost their access to power. So that was just one of these an illustration of what I'm thinking about. So that leads us to some of the key lessons, right? So one is that whatever you want to support, whatever program or action you want to support, you should make sure that it will empower interest groups that can lobby for them in the future. The day you've lost the energy to support them, you want them to be self-sustaining and to be there to fight. So for instance, when you renewables, what was key is to create firms, large firms like Vestas, which suddenly had a voice and could lobby on their own behalf, right? So it was important to empower these interest groups to survive them. And I realize that interest groups is often seen as a dirty word. We don't like them. We think them as a threat to democracy. But in this case, it was important because without these interest groups, we may have seen the interest in renewables being killed very early in the process, and that would have been possibly the end of it, at least in the short run. You also need to think about building coalitions with groups that have a reach beyond the one you have, right? And that sounds in some ways self-evident, but it's hard to do. It's really hard to build coalitions because presumably when you build alliances with other groups, it means that you don't necessarily agree with them on everything, right? And you need to think about how much you're willing to compromise your principles in some sense, if it is to get successful and important policy that you really care about through. One example that is often being used, right, is, or one criticism that some environmental groups get is their hostility to nuclear power. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, so I don't want to go into the history of this, but you can think that that might have been one of these coalitions that could have helped renewables grow faster, historically speaking, in some countries. The third lesson I want to mention here is really not to focus that much on the short-term consequences. I see a lot of debates, especially among economists, about, oh, is policy A more efficient than policy B or not? I see a lot of complex calculations about finding the social cost of something to the third decimal point. And my sense is that tends to be wasted efforts. We're in the real world, we are in a situation where we're, I say here third best, but we're probably in the 15th best world. And we need to acknowledge that. And what we need to think about more is what can feasibly be the most effective in the long run. What can we do that is actually going to work, even if it's not exactly what we would think is the most optimal right now? What could be a policy that could both survive these fraught political processes, but also then achieve the kind of change that we need, right? And I think this matter of thinking about policy that can survive is important. And so, you know, there's a call here for a bit of cynicism in terms of thinking about policy that may not be exactly the ones that appeal to our ethical preferences, but one that can survive the next battles, right? So when you lose election, that you're not back to square one, but you can actually build on what you've created, and that reversals ideally do not happen. Now, that creates a number of opportunities when we think about current situations. Again, this is perhaps more speculative, but it's, you know, thinking about creating new alliances, thinking about ways to weaken the political influence of fossil fuel. These are all possibilities that seem more real right now in an era of crisis than it would be under normal circumstances. But I also want to caution that while we think about these crises as, you know, windows of opportunities, right? The term itself suggests that there is this potential better place we can go to right now if we're being smart about it. There's also a real risk of genuine setbacks. I just want to show you here some figures from Apple. Apple is tracking people's searches on their maps, and think about how many people are looking for searches that are, you know, walks, or that are about driving somewhere, or that are about taking public transport. And what they show right now is that public transport searches have not recovered yet at all. Right, so people are looking for ways gradually more and more to go from A to B by car, but are not at all yet looking about how to get from A to B by public transport. Of course, that's going to be an artifact of the fact that many cities have considerably slowed down public transportation, but it is going to be one of the concerns we may have is, are we going to be able to recover in terms of the public transport network? The link here is, of course, with a general conversation about thinking about solutions to climate change. Driving is obviously a less optimal approach than taking public transport. And so we have this risk that the crisis is not only a window of opportunity, but also a window of real dangers. And just, so this is for New York City. So there's been 83% less searches for trips on public transport. DC, where Johns Hopkins is based, again, we see driving is starting to make a comeback, but people are still taking buses. London, pretty much the same. And then, yeah, so I thought I had Paris as well, and Paris is the same. So we see these kind of trends, and I just want to highlight these as potential dangers to be trapped in a world that is actually even worse than the one before. So let me just think about these political challenges, right? There are many technological challenges ahead that are worth thinking about how to decarbonize transport, electricity, and so forth. But I want to think about political challenges. The main one is that if you're thinking about decarbonizing, if you're thinking about moving away from fossil fuel even more and towards, say, renewables, well, it's hard to do it in good times already, right? It's hard to punish industries because these industries will kick and scream, especially the more they have to lose, the more they're going to kick and scream. And so they're going to be very hostile to that. So that's hard in good times already, as the last 40 years have shown. It's even harder in bad times because you're threatening industries where you may have a large number of people who do not make high wages. And can you really credibly, if you're a politician, say, well, I know things are hard right now, but it makes things even harder for you because we don't think that your industry should continue, right? That's going to be politically very hard. And, you know, case in point in the US, right? You don't want to, if you're right now running for, say, president, you don't want to lose Pennsylvania, you don't want to lose Wisconsin, you don't want to lose these places which may have, you know, something to lose in the short run from a move away from fossil fuels. I mentioned here France, which has, according to reports, taken an interesting approach to deal with Air France, which is struggling like many airlines. And it is currently, according to reports, conditioning the aid it will provide to Air France to the company dropping flights that could be done by train, right? So that would be the kind of of bargains that would presumably be good from a climatic perspective, but there might be the exception rather than a rule if we think about what's happening in other countries. So, back to the same theme is how can you create coalitions that can get reforms through and make them stable? I mentioned here the just transition, which is a buzzword that is coming up all over the place, which is the idea that you may want to compensate losing communities that lose from the clean energy transition. So think in the US about West Virginia, think about coaling areas in Germany, Poland, in India, and elsewhere. And perhaps here there's some kind of grand bargain to be stricken where you can try to exchange transition against some kind of compensation for these communities, right? And that might be a way to do this. This is, of course, very speculative. We don't really know that, but that would be one way to think about this. And to conclude, just thinking about long-term challenges, what I said, everything is for somebody who's concerned about the short run, who might be looking for some ways to think about what they want to push for in terms of their daily activism or as elected officials. In the long run, of course, we'll have a whole other range of problems to deal with. And I'm kind of thinking about, I started the presentation by talking about an era of crisis. Well, ultimately, what we want to have is some form of sustainable living, right? And that's going to require to think about how we can raise living standards across the world in a way that is compatible with sustainable development. And that's still a question that is a challenging one. How can we maintain our living standards while making sure that everybody has access to them without living in a world of repeated crisis? I'm not sure somebody has a clear answer to this, right? Because there might be some trade-offs here. And that's going to be ultimately, ethically, philosophically, the question about how can we make our societies more resilient. Now, of course, famous quip, in the long term, we're all dead. What is going to happen, we'll muddle through somehow to get there, hopefully. So what we need to do right now is really think, what can we do best that was going to help our planet for the next at least 50 years. And with this being said, that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much to everybody, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, for a detailed and thoughtful presentation. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. So just a reminder again to the audience, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A to ask them, and I will then moderate the discussion. The first question is from Tineke Theo, who is asking about the short-term, long-term trade-off. So long-term benefits of coalition building only come to fruition a few decades later, but we don't have a few decades in order to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. What's your take on accelerating the process of decarbonization, especially in hostile environments like the United States?
Wow, yeah, awesome question. So I think, so what you want in some sense, right? So you have to kind of think about the trade-off between what is feasible and what is going to be effective, right? Because you can think about very drastic policies that would cut down emissions massively, but they don't have a realistic chance of being implemented. And I'm not trying to make a case that people are, utopians and so forth. I'm just thinking that there's a path ahead where some programs have just a higher chance of being implemented. Now, if you want to go fast, right, what you need to think about is what are going to be the obstacles to get a certain number of policies fast, right? So what could really hamper things happening in the short run? So in the case of the US, I would think about the fact that the US has a lot of veto players, that is actors that can shut down, that can prevent any kind of reform from happening. So what we think about is where action might be happening faster is going to be, for instance, at the state level, right? Because at the federal level moves very slowly. And so moving one down level might be the better target. It also means then, if you think about it with activist hat is, well, then what really matters is making sure that we're getting the people that we think will be most likely to vote for these measures at the state level, right? So, there was, for instance, in the Democratic primary, a lot of criticism about everybody wanted to be president, but nobody wanted to be governor first. So thinking about, getting more people involved at the level where you can, where you can implement things fast would be better. And I think that would be good as well, because when you think about it, at some point, if you're able to get successful action happening in one state, again, just focusing on the US here, the chance that they can spread elsewhere is going to be better than if it's something that is going to be imposed at the federal level after 30 years of debate, right? And so that might be also a way to kind of think about a domino effect, right? Where if you can get something happen in a critical state, it could then trigger a kind of a chain reaction. I'm not saying it will, but I'm just saying that if you want to get fast, that might be, I think, probably the one way to go about this.
Great. So let me actually follow up. I want to ask a follow-up question on this. So what is your take on how do you think the COVID-19 crisis will shape the politics of climate? Do you think it will have some major impact moving forward, and how to deal with that?
On climate, you see how if it has a side effect on climate as well?
Yes, climate policy in particular. Less the emissions, I think we have established kind of a 5% reduction or so, but what about in terms of policy and politics?
Yeah, so I think, one thing that we can see, right, is that measures in most countries have had some kind of dramatic effect on the economy, and that there is generally reasonably large support for public spending across parties that may not always be necessarily in favor of it, right? So I could see situations in which you can come up with bargains, or well, with agreements across parties where you could earmark some of the resources for climate policy, right? And again, I'm thinking here that, I think if we take the example of the US, right, when we think about some battle states like Pennsylvania, where I happen to live, you can think that both parties have some kind of incentive to see forms of compensations for people that are adversely affected. And so you could imagine here that there's some new room for bargains to be stricken that did not exist before, where you now have some joint interest in seeing supportive policies being implemented that could have a climate component. So I think that's going to be more on the side of spending our way out of climate issues rather than on let's be more restraining and cut down emissions through, say, taxes, which I think is probably still not likely to be supported. But in terms of empowering some programs that could lead to a faster transition, that's probably where I would see the action happening.
Excellent. So I have another very interesting question here from one of the attendees. So if you could comment on the applicability of these concepts like coalition building and just transition in countries that still have kind of an energy poverty problem, or lack of electrification. So for example, the attendee is giving an example. If you try to reduce reliance on diesel generators, you might run into trouble with the diesel mafia in these communities. So how do you think this kind of dynamic would play out in this case?
Yeah, I mean, what I've said so far, for most parts, the kind of the background to what I presented was mostly having it was mostly about reasonably well-functioning democracies where issues such as corruption were not as biting, right? And in work I'm currently, which have been research I've been doing in the last few years, I've shown also that, for instance, renewable energy has been more likely to be deployed in countries that have reasonably well-functioning institutions, right? So more democratic, less corruption, better rule of law, and so forth, right? So bringing in the kerosene mafia messes up some of what I've shown. This being said, ultimately, the kind of political rationale that I presented today is a fairly generic one. And it's one that is rooted in the idea that people are complicated, but they generally have some kind of driving interests, and you might be able to put together, to bridge or to find common ground with even actors you may not necessarily think would be on your side otherwise, if you can find some incentive to do so for them, right? So if you can incentivize them to join. So I'm not trying to say that you should bribe the kerosene mafia or that you should try to bring them on board. But you can think about other actors in these settings that may have suddenly an incentive in seeing reasonable, good provision of electricity, right? So for instance, if you think about renewable energy powering small firms, these firms will then have an incentive to also make their voices heard if there is something that could threaten their business line, right? Again, for the specific case that you mentioned, this may be more complicated than that, and it is going to be more complicated than that. But ultimately, what you want is to have as many people on your side as possible to make sure that they will be voices that defend what you want.
Great. So we have another question from Tineke Theo next. The question is, do you have any insights on the transportation transition? Are there any particular differences to the energy transition?
So that's a great question. And I think people like Jonas Nam, who gave last week or last webinar, would probably be in a better situation to respond. So one of the key challenges with transportation, at least if we think about just cars for a second, is going to be that there are a number of challenges. For instance, having a network of charging stations that require some form generally of public support. Maybe not when we see what happened with Tesla, but in general, you have a need, just like in renewables, you have some kind of need for public support. Now, assuming you have public support, I think the next challenge you will run into is that the car industry, which has been around for a long time, has not everywhere been equally willing to entertain these dramatic changes that would come with, say, electric cars, right? And there's a parallel here with utilities, which for long were happy with their coal power plants and did not like to think about moving to solar. Now, why do I mention this? It's because in some countries, say for instance, Germany, the car industry is a massive employer, right? So it's a very, very, very large employer. And it's an employer that is both influential on the right and on the left. So the issue is going to be that the producing countries, the car producing countries, there will be strong political challenges to avoid hurting these industries too much. And again, especially when we think about a time of crisis, right? Because if you are now the Chancellor of Germany, you're not going to slash your entire car industry right now at a time when the economy in general is almost tanking. And so I think that there are these parallels to what we saw with respect to electricity. But in some ways, it's going to be even worse just because of the sheer number of people that are working in these areas. And I come here back to what I alluded to with the just transition angle, right? Which again is very, people talk a lot about this. But we need to think about solutions for workers who are in industries that will struggle in the long term for sure, because in the long term, we know they will struggle. But how can we facilitate their transition to speed things up a little bit, right? And that might reduce their concern. It might facilitate the transition by just making sure that they're not going to be, all of them being overly vocal, and they will perhaps take new opportunities elsewhere. The problem at this stage, and I'll just finish that response on this, is that these communities, which will be presumably hostile to cleaner transportation sectors, we don't know them well, right? What I mean by this is not that nobody talks to them. It's that there's a lot of survey work, for instance, being done about what the average American, European, Indian, and so forth person wants. But the communities tend to be very localized in some regions, and we just don't know that much about what they want. Do they, would they be happy to look for new jobs? Would they be interested in retraining? Would they be, for instance, okay with a reduction of jobs in exchange for cash, right? Everybody gets a check of $20,000. Would that be something that would be, would they be okay with? We just don't know. And so that's part of the work that I've been doing at ISEP, is to study these communities with them more thoughtfully and more, not just assuming that what some researchers do is assuming to know where they want, but actually ask them to get a sense of what they're interested in.
Wonderful. So we still have 3 questions here on the list. So let's make sure we get through all of these. There's some really interesting stuff here. So Aaron Buzogani is asking about the domino effect in climate policy, or this laboratory federalism. So he's saying, isn't what we see with COVID-19 kind of the opposite of this laboratory federalism or Madisonian argument, where different states are making very different choices, and as a result, the situation is actually worse for everyone? Yeah. So how do you think kind of this compared to what we've seen in climate change?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So there are a few things I want to say. So one is that ultimately, I think that if we think about the learning effect here with respect to COVID, in the end, I suspect that it's going to be very small in terms of learning what policies work best. I think that actually it's going to be very hard to learn lessons from that. Just to give one example why I suspect this is that if you think, for instance, all the debates happening right now about Sweden, right? Well, given that all the neighbors of Sweden do other stuff that could, act as a buffer zone, it's going to be very hard to know whether Sweden, for instance, was successful or whether it was failing because of what others doing. So just to say here that I think that's one difference. The other difference is that with the COVID, say for instance in the US, with the states as lab or states as experimental settings, is that when we have these highly contagious phenomenon, then it's going again to be a case where it's going to limit what states can do in terms of learning from each other's experience, and therefore is not necessarily an ideal setting for this argument, in the sense that if I were to say to defend the state as lab argument, I would probably not use a contagious virus as supportive evidence. I think this is not exactly true for a case like climate change, because what is needed with climate change is to come up with programs or new technologies, and it doesn't matter who comes up with a new technology, because once it's available, it can spread fairly quickly. It doesn't always spread quickly, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but it can spread, right? So you're always, in some sense, with climate change at the frontier, and so it just needs one person, one institution, one state, one country to have a breakthrough, and that can kind of spread in other places to help them out. And that's what we saw with wind technology, right? So there were initial developments in California, and then that informed what was happening in Denmark and vice versa. And so that's how this worked.
So we still have a long list.
Okay, I'll just finish it here. But I will just say that you just have to be careful with learning, is because even though you can learn, not everybody is going to learn, and that's something that we don't fully understand yet, how these learning effects happen.
So if we can get I'll try to group these questions a little bit. I'd like to get through this if we can. So there's questions about policy options. So what can governments do to get private companies and people and citizens to invest in decarbonization, and especially maybe some sort of more creative alternatives than subsidies, feed-in tariffs? Any thoughts on this policy instrument question?
Are you grouping them or?
Yeah, that was two questions.
Oh, that was two questions. Okay, yeah. That's a good question because I think so I think there are two things. So one is that some of the renewables are now reasonably mature and are not necessarily. It's not necessarily that they need that much help in terms of R&D from the government side. And here it's going to be more about coming up with ways to, for instance, reduce local hostility. We know that in some places, for instance, voters are not very keen on saying a windmill next to their house. People refer to this as the NIMBY effect. I want to think of it as more as, my house is my retirement account and I don't want anything that could threaten its value. So I think finding ways to reduce local hostility is going to be one way that is more creative and in terms of promoting these kind of developments. So I think that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also need to think still about promoting new stuff because people like to think about solar and wind, but there are potentially other new clean technologies that could be promoted, which are not as mature, and they will still need help. And they will need help not only in terms of being promoted, but also then not being threatened by wind and solar, because wind and solar are becoming the new incumbents, and they will have also some interests against these new things. Now that's, for instance, an argument made by Varun Sivaram about giving enough room for newer and newer clean technologies to grow. So I think that's one thing that, again, the political economy of this has to be thought out carefully.
Great. So the next, I have questions about renewables. So there's a question. One is it important in your view to kind of invest in improving the quality of the electric grid to allow more renewables penetration? And how would this look like in countries that are currently subsidizing fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal?
Yeah, so here we're getting to the border of becoming more of an engineer's question than a social scientist. The future of the grid is something that I'm fascinated by. There's been a lot of work by coming up with scenarios of having more and more decentralized systems where you could imagine localized grids that could, for instance, rely on electric cars serving as kind of existing batteries and so forth. It's very hard to think about how such a complex system will evolve. But ultimately, what is really needed is to come up with a way to provide sustainable funding to both maintaining the grid, whatever it will look like. And that's going to require thinking about what will utilities look like in the coming decades. Because at this stage, many utilities are going to be struggling in terms of finding what their business model will look like. And it used to be that they had some kind of influence on grid maintenance. There's been some kind of, in some places, outsourced to nobody, and we see a record number of blackouts in the US, for instance, because of that. So it's going to be about finding an entire system. So what I would say is simply, it's not just a matter of sustaining the grid, but it's also going to be a matter of coming up with a business model that makes everybody happy enough that they will invest in its maintenance. And very lastly, on the fossil fuel subsidies, I mean, in most cases they should be either cut altogether or replaced by something else to help populations that need it, right? If it's about maintaining the poor, it's about helping poor people, then it's going to be about you'll need to find new solutions for that in any case.
So I'll just take a very last question. We are almost out of time. So in a kind of capitalist system like the United States, which is very heavily private sector driven, what kind of approaches should the federal government take here? And to what extent do you think will the outcome of the presidential election this year shape prospects of climate policy?
So on the second question, a lot of action is happening already at the state level in the US. And my sense is that, I mean, it would be great to have the more inclined toward climate policies the person in the White House is, the better. But ultimately, a lot of action is already going to happen at the state level. We see states, for instance, combining to have emission trading systems. And I think, given that, again, that's where the most realistic action is going to happen anyway. it will have an effect, but ultimately I think I would worry a lot about state level outcomes as well. And then on the first half, sorry, it escapes me right now. What was the first half of the question?
Yeah, just what kind of measures in a kind of capitalist private sector consumption driven system like the US are the right ones for federal government?
Yeah, that's so, you know, the one that is still pretty much one that is undoubtedly one where governments can do something without screwing up things too much is going to be research and development for sure, right? And where we think, for instance, in terms of development of perovskite, solar power, and so forth, there's room here for public funding to help promote these technologies. And then the more we move along the path of a technology becoming mature, the more risk there is for you know, this somewhat inefficient, suboptimal alliances between private and public sector that could lead to long-term problems. There's still room for them in some sense, but I think at that stage, what we need to think about from a state level perspective is more about on the electricity side, having better rules of the game in terms of, again, things such as maintaining the grid and promoting the inclusion of renewables within that. So it might be more about institution than about supporting specific firms.
Okay, perfect. This has been great. Thanks, Michael, for taking the time to talk to us. A very, very interesting, wide-ranging discussion based on a thoughtful presentation. So for the audience, thanks for joining. We will share the slides and the presentation with you on email after this. And again, for more information about the work we do at ISEP, please take a look at size-isep.org. Thanks a lot and have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.